The dinner party at the Wilding estate in Beverly Hills was dying a slow, expensive death. It was May 12, 1956. Inside the sprawling mansion, the air was thick with the scent of gardenias, expensive cigars, and the unspoken boredom of Hollywood's royalty. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over men in tuxedos who talked about box office returns and women in diamonds who talked about other women. In the center of it all sat Elizabeth Taylor. She was 24 years old, arguably the most beautiful woman on the planet, and she was bored out of her mind. To the guests, she looked like a porcelain doll, perfectly painted, still and serene. But beneath the table, her hand was clenched into a fist so tight her knuckles were white. She wasn't just a star. She was a caged animal waiting for the lock to break. Across the table sat Montgomery Clift. Monty, the only person in the room who felt real to her. But tonight, Monty looked like a ghost haunting his own body. His skin was gray, his eyes glazed over with a cocktail of painkillers and alcohol that he used to silence the demons in his head. While the other guests laughed politely at a producer's bad joke, Monty was vibrating with a nervous energy that only Elizabeth seemed to notice. He reached for his wine glass, and his hand trembled so violently that the red liquid sloshed onto the white tablecloth. The table went silent. A few guests looked away, embarrassed. Elizabeth didn't look away. She caught his eye, sending a silent message across the floral centerpiece. Hold on. Just hold on. She knew what he was hiding. The industry saw a heartthrob. She saw a terrified boy lost in a man's world. They were twins not by blood, but by scars. Both owned by studios, both worshipped and consumed by millions, both desperately lonely in rooms full of people. I have to go, Monty mumbled, pushing his chair back. The sound was harsh against the marble floor. I'm tired. The fog. It's getting thick. Michael Wilding, Elizabeth's husband, a man as polished and dull as the silverware, nodded dismissively. Of course, old boy. Drive carefully. Elizabeth stood up. I'll walk you out. Liz, sit down, Michael said, his voice low, a warning wrapped in a smile. Don't make a scene. Elizabeth turned her famous violet eyes on her husband. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She simply evaporated his authority with a look that could freeze hell, and turned her back on him. She followed Monty out into the cool, misty night. Outside, the air was heavy. The winding roads of Benedict Canyon were treacherous even on a clear night. Tonight, they looked like the throat of a dark beast waiting to swallow something whole. Monty leaned against his car, a 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air. He looked small against the metal. I don't feel right, Bessie, he whispered, using his nickname for her. Everything is spinning. Stay here, she said, grabbing his lapels. Sleep in the guest room. Please, Monty. Don't drive. He shook his head, a stubborn, childish gesture. Can't. Need to be alone. Need to. Just drive. He climbed into the car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, a mechanical beast waking up. Elizabeth stood on the driveway, hugging her elbows, shivering in her white chiffon gown. She watched the taillights fade into the darkness, swallowed by the curve of the hill. A heavy stone of dread settled in her stomach. She didn't go back inside immediately. She stood there, listening to the silence of the canyon. And then the silence broke. It wasn't a screech of brakes. There was no time for brakes. It was a singular, sickening crunch. The sound of steel folding like paper, of glass shattering into a million diamonds, of a heavy object hitting the earth with the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. The sound echoed up the canyon walls, violent and obscene. Inside the house, the music stopped. The guests froze, champagne flutes halfway to their mouths. What was that? Someone asked nervously. A car backfiring, Michael Wilding suggested, though his face had gone pale. Probably just a truck. But the door burst open. Kevin McCarthy, Another actor who had left just behind Monty stood in the frame. He looked like a man who had seen the devil. His face was devoid of blood, his eyes wide and unseeing. "He's dead," Kevin screamed. The scream tore through the polite atmosphere of the party like a knife. "Monty, he's dead. The car. Oh God, the car." Panic is a strange thing. In a room full of powerful men, studio executives, directors, heroes of the silver screen, panic turned them into statues. They looked at each other. They looked for a phone. They looked for someone else to take charge. They were paralyzed by the implications. The press. The police. The scandal. Is he really dead? I can't be seen here. Elizabeth Taylor didn't think. She didn't calculate. She moved. "Call an ambulance," she barked. A command that cracked like a whip, snapping the men out of their trance. But she didn't wait to see if they obeyed. She hiked up her couture gown, kicked off her satin heels, and ran out the door. She ran into the darkness, barefoot. The asphalt of the road was cold and sharp, tearing at the soles of her feet, but she didn't feel it. She ran down the steep, winding hill towards the crash site, her breath tearing at her throat. Behind her, she could hear the shouts of the men, telling her to stop, to come back, to wait for the professionals. "Liz, it's dangerous. The gas tank." She didn't stop. She ran faster. She rounded the bend and saw it. The Chevrolet was wrapped around a utility pole. The car was unrecognizable, a twisted sculpture of violence. Smoke hissed from the engine block. The smell of gasoline was so strong it tasted like poison in the air. The car was perched precariously on the side of the hill. One wrong move and it could slide further down into the darkness. Or explode. Elizabeth reached the wreckage. The driver's side was crushed. Through the shattered window she saw him. Montgomery Clift was slumped over the wheel. He wasn't moving. Blood was everywhere, so much blood that it looked black in the moonlight. Covered the dashboard, the seat, his beautiful shirt. "Monty!" she screamed, grabbing the door handle. It was jammed. The metal had fused together. She threw herself against the door, pulling with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a woman of her size. It wouldn't budge. She looked through the broken window. Monty's head was thrown back at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open but unseeing, and he was making a sound, a terrible, wet, gurgling sound. He was choking. Behind her, the men from the party had finally arrived. They stood 10 feet back, terrified of the leaking fuel. "Get back, Liz!" Rock Hudson shouted, his voice filled with fear. "It's going to blow up. Give me a light!" She screamed back at them, not taking her eyes off Monty. "Someone give me a damn light!" No one moved. They were protecting their faces, their careers, their lives. "Cowards!" she spat. She didn't need them. Without a second of hesitation, Elizabeth Taylor did the unthinkable. She didn't retreat. She climbed in. Ignoring the jagged shards of glass that lined the window frame like shark teeth, she thrust her upper body into the wreckage. The glass sliced into her arms, cutting deep into the soft flesh, but she pushed through. Her white dress caught on the metal, tearing, soaking up the oil and blood. Inside the car, the heat was suffocating. The smell of copper and gas was overwhelming. She was face to face with her best friend, and he was dying. Before we dive into the most gruesome and heroic moment of Elizabeth Taylor's life, take a moment to subscribe. If you want to know the real stories behind the Hollywood legends, hit that like button. It helps us keep the history alive. "Monty, look at me," she commanded, grabbing his face with her bloody hands. His skin was cold. His jaw was locked tight. The gurgling was getting worse. He was drowning, not in water but in his own blood. She realized with horror what was happening. The impact had smashed his face into the dashboard. His teeth, his perfect, famous teeth, had been knocked out. They had fallen back into his throat and were lodged in his windpipe. He wasn't dying from the crash. He was choking on his own teeth. Open your mouth, she grunted, trying to pry his jaw open. It was locked in a rigor of shock. Outside, the sirens were wailing in the distance, but they were too far away. He had seconds, not minutes. Damn you, Monty. Don't you dare die on me. She forced her fingers between his lips. She felt the jagged edges of broken bone. She pushed harder, forcing his jaw down. He convulsed, his body fighting for air, and his jaw clamped down on her fingers. She screamed in pain but didn't pull away. She shoved her hand deeper into his throat. Imagine the scene. The most glamorous woman in the world, half inside a wrecked car, her dress ruined, her hand deep inside a dying man's throat, while Hollywood's most powerful men watched from the shadows, too afraid to help. Her fingers touched something hard and slippery in the back of his throat. The first tooth. It was wedged deep. She hooked her finger around it. The blood made it slippery. She dug her nails in, finding purchase, and pulled. Came loose. She flicked it onto the floor of the car. He gasped, but the airway was still blocked. One more, she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face, mixing with the blood. One more, baby. She went back in, deeper this time. She could feel his life fluttering like a trapped bird against her palm. She found the second tooth. It was lodged sideways. She twisted her hand, ignoring the pain in her own fingers, and yanked it out. The sound that followed was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. A giant, ragged intake of breath. Monty's chest heaved. He coughed, spraying blood all over Elizabeth's face. Into her eyes, her mouth, her hair. She didn't wipe it off. She pulled him into her arms, cradling his broken head against her chest, rocking him in the cramped, blood-soaked cabin. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely. "I've got you. You're not going anywhere." When the paramedics finally arrived, they had to physically pull her away from him. She fought them at first, refusing to let go until she was sure he was breathing steadily. They pulled Monty out. His face was a ruin. The left side was crushed, his nose broken, his lip torn open. The beauty that had made him a star was gone. And then the second wave of the nightmare began. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, the darkness of the canyon was illuminated by a blinding flash. Pop, pop, pop. The paparazzi. They had intercepted the police radio calls. They had arrived like hyenas to feast on the carcass. One photographer, a man with a cheap suit and a hungry look, stepped right up to the stretcher. He raised his camera, aiming directly at Monty's destroyed face. This picture would be worth a fortune. The monster of Hollywood. It would end Monty's career before he even reached the hospital. Elizabeth saw him. She was standing by the ambulance, covered in blood, shivering, her feet cut and bleeding. But when she saw that lens point at her friend, something ancient woke up inside her. She lunged. She didn't look like a movie star anymore. She looked like a fury. She grabbed the photographer by his lapels and slammed him against the side of the ambulance with a force that rattled the vehicle. "You give me that film," she hissed, her voice low and terrifying. "Hey, lady, freedom of the press." The man stammered, trying to push her away. "Freedom." Elizabeth laughed. A dark, manic sound. "If you take one picture of him like this, if you show the world what happened here tonight, I will buy your newspaper. I will buy the studio you work for. And I will make sure you are blacklisted from every corner of this earth until you starve." She leaned in closer, her face inches from his, blood dripping from her chin. "Do you know who I am? I'm Elizabeth Taylor, and I always get what I want. Give me the film." The photographer looked into her violet eyes and saw absolute destruction. He trembled. Slowly, he opened the back of his camera, pulled out the roll of film, and exposed it to the light, ruining the photos. "Get out of here," she whispered. He ran. She turned back to the other photographers, who had lowered their cameras in stunned silence. "Anyone else?" she challenged. No one moved. She climbed into the back of the ambulance with Monty. She held his hand the entire way to the hospital, singing softly to him when he groaned in pain. She blocked the doctors who tried to bar her from the trauma room. She stayed until he was stable. It was dawn when she finally returned to the Wilding estate. The party was long over, but a few stragglers remained, drinking coffee, whispering about the tragedy. When the door opened, they fell silent. Elizabeth Taylor stood in the doorway. The white chiffon dress was now stiff with dried blood. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her arms were bandaged. She was barefoot, her feet dirty and cut. She looked like a survivor of a war. Michael Wilding stood up, looking uncomfortable. "Liz, my God. You look. Maybe you should go upstairs and change." He wanted to erase the evidence. He wanted the pretty doll back. Elizabeth walked past him. She walked past the producers and the agents. She walked to the bar. She reached into the pocket of her ruined dress. She pulled out the 2 teeth she had extracted from Monty's throat. She placed them on the polished mahogany counter with a soft click-click. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. She poured herself a glass of Jack Daniels. Her hand wasn't shaking anymore. "He lives," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke and the screaming. She took a sip, the whiskey burning her throat. She turned to face the room. She didn't look at them with anger, but with pity. They were soft. They were pretend people living in a pretend world. But she had touched the bone. She had felt the blood. She had bargained with death and won. "He lives," she repeated. "No thanks to any of you." She finished her drink, turned on her heel, and walked up the grand staircase, leaving the blood-stained dress, the teeth, and her old life behind her. From that night on, Elizabeth Taylor was never just a star again. The industry knew. The world eventually knew. You could gossip about her marriages, you could critique her weight, you could judge her jewels. But you could never, ever doubt her loyalty. When the AIDS crisis hit decades later, and those same cowardly men ran away from dying friends, hiding behind masks and fear, Elizabeth Taylor would be the one to walk into the fire again. Because she had been practicing since that dark night in 1956. She knew that when the world is ending, you don't run. You crawl into the wreckage and you pull your people out. The legend of Elizabeth Taylor isn't in the Oscars she won, but in the lives she saved when the cameras weren't rolling. If this story gave you chills, share it. Let the world know the real power of the violet-eyed queen. And subscribe for more stories that history tried to hide.